Thanks, Frank. Thanks for your statement, and thanks everybody for being here. Everybody ready? Yes? Yes. So we're going to change gears a bit. As you might know, I'm the narrative lady of the Game Center, and whenever I'm asked who I want to bring to practice, I'm always looking for people who make interesting games that relate to narrative. And I'm really, really pleased to have three of the people who've made some of my favorite games in the last couple of years. Really, really excited. Um, what is interesting, as I was preparing up on the talks for today, I realized that our presenters have a really interesting background, a mix of backgrounds. They're game designers, but they also work in things like software art, music, all of them actually, visual art. They're also writers. They do programming. You know, there's this kind of like quintuple thread, and they have very strong ties to other arts and other media, specifically theater. I don't know if this is going to come up in the game in the talks, but there's this running theme of actually using theater as a reference. So to start with the next session, we have Jake Elliott and Tomas Kamenci. Did I say it right? Yes. From Cardboard Computer. You might know their game Kentucky Route Zero, which won the Visual Art Award at IGF, and also Visual Art Award and the Story World Award at Indicate. And they've been working together in a variety of things, you know, from installation, experimental music. So what we're going to hear about today is about dream states in Kentucky Route Zero. So I just hand it over to Tomas and Jake.
The stuff I sent you in this text file? Or? Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. Can I just put this on here? Okay. Ooh. Okay, let's hold it. Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having us so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, that would be super. It was just sliding. Oh, perfect. Okay, yeah, you got to balance it. Great. So this talk is called The Half Asleep Moments. And it's sort of a catalog of moments in our game, Kentucky Route Zero, in which the character or the player is moving into or out of sleep. So these are these moments transitioning into and out of sleep are usually called hypnagogic and hypnopompic moments for moving into and moving out of sleep. We're going to look a bit at how this motif has evolved in our game over time and how its evolution corresponds with other kinds of evolutions in our design practice. These hypnagogic and hypnopompic states have always been kind of a source of curiosity and wonder for us, both in the way that they blur dreams and waking life kind of tangibly, also in their cultural history as a site of sort of mystical experiences. For example, in this film from 1920, Robert Wiene's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, about this sleepwalker who, because he is kind of existing in this state in between being asleep and being awake, he has magical powers. He can tell the future, and he's also open to hypnotic suggestion by his evil captor, the evil psychiatrist, Dr. Caligari, who keeps him in this state of sort of half wakefulness and uses him to murder people, which is something, I'm on Lexapro, I can relate to that, and I'm sure a lot of other people in 2014 can. So we use these moments in our game as invitations to participate, to borrow a term from theater, invitations for the audience to participate. They're open moments when the players are co-conspirators in the mystery and not just being strung along a chain of sort of plot artifices. So first, I'm going to examine some half-asleep scenes that mostly use text, and then Tomas will explore some more spatial and visual experiments with the subject. Is that the video we're still running? Or just a weird drone? It's cool. I'm into it. Okay. So this game has a lot of text. It demands a lot of reading on the part of the player. And one of the first problems that we started to solve in working on KRZ was just how to display text in real time, how to treat text as a real-time phenomenon. We've always kind of tried to treat text as an event and not just as like a repository for information. Is it possible to get the lights down any lower? This game's like really dark throughout. I don't know if it's... Is it? Thanks. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Hypnagogic, yeah. So we treat text as something that reading as in the game as something that happens in real time. It's synchronous with the rest of the game. It's not asynchronous. It's not like you don't like toggle over to like a codex and read text for a while at your own pace. You don't have an audio tape that's playing as you walk around that sort of reads text at a pace that's unconcerned with the pace of the rest of the game. The text and the reading experience in our game is like part of the rest of the timing and pacing of the game. The text that appears on the screen at a specific tempo, or actually at one of 3 specific tempos you can choose in the options menu: drowsy, steady, or sudden. And some kinds of punctuation briefly slow down the tempo. For example, the period character creates a short pause. And our dialogue, I can take responsibility for this. We kind of overuse ellipses in the dialogue to kind of break up the timing of it, because these 3 periods happen to create a kind of like convincing natural sort of pause, which you see a lot of video games using ellipses and overusing ellipses this way. Like this one, for example, this one, right? So it's kind of ridiculous when you take this stuff out of context, but in context, as a sort of real-time text event in the moment, it makes a lot of sense. It creates a sort of natural pause. So this is a scene from Act 1. This is one of the text and sound only vignettes in the map section. We made all of these near the end of development of Act 1, and this is one of the first ones we made. So it's a place that we established a lot of how these scenes were going to function pragmatically. In this scene, Conway's in this bait shop, and there are a few of these tanks of water along the wall that presumably have live bait in them. You can direct the character Conway to reach his arms into the tank, even though you can't see what's in there, which in like a 90s or 80s text adventure would probably kill you. But in our game, nothing happens until you reach the 3rd tank, and then you get an electric shock and you're knocked unconscious. And let's see if I can find that. So part of going unconscious in this moment, we kind of cue that to the player with this immediate audio change. So you hear the sort of humming, droning of the fish tanks giving way to these birds chirping and outdoor sounds, daytime sounds when this scene takes place at night, to suggest to the player that they're kind of entering a sub-scene or like a nested dream within a dream kind of scene. This was kind of the genesis of this technique that I'm going to show in a few other cases next. So that moment's like literally about falling asleep or going unconscious and dreaming and then waking up. But the next iteration was kind of more figuratively about pushing and popping in and out of nested contexts. So this is from Limits and Demonstrations, which is the free interlude between Act 1 and 2. In this scene, in this moment, Emily, Ben, and Bob are playing an art game called Overdubbed Nam June Pike Installation in the style of Edward Packard. The other artworks that these characters can examine in the interlude yield like really short conversations where they just kind of do a little bit of interpretation or make fun of the artwork they're looking at or something and then move on. But this one is like significantly deeper in the sense that it goes on a lot longer and it has like a lot more to it. So we return to this technique that we developed in the bait shop originally to kind of underscore that contrast between this piece and the other pieces in the scene. Also, this piece is actually made up. It's kind of probably hard to read in this like 3D or in this like really small version. But this piece is actually made up of a bunch of tape, magnetic audio tape that's taped onto the wall. It's based on an actual Nam June Pike piece. So playing with sound cues to indicate the effect that those tapes are used is to kind of create a choose-your-own-adventure story in the style of Edward Packard, where you're kind of moving around between different strips of tape. So because they're made up of audio tape, it's kind of suggests already that we should be using audio cues in some way or another to indicate kind of spatially where the characters are in the story. But also, you can see maybe in the background the environment is sort of starting to fade to black. That happens over the course of about a minute. It was something we did really slowly in order to kind of catch the player off guard, maybe hoping they would kind of not notice it until suddenly they looked and couldn't see the environment. It would be like a surprise to them, to suggest that Emily and Ben and Bob, and by extension the player, are kind of getting lost in this story. Okay, I might skip a little bit, but so storage facility. Here in this storage facility, self-storage facility in Act 2, the scene fades to black again while Conway's listening to this tape recording of a homily on the virtue of work. This is a sort of Catholic church built into a self-storage unit, run by this janitor. So Conway's friend Shannon walks away to do something, and then he starts listening to this taped sermon. And again, the scene kind of fades out. In this case, we're using the motif to underscore that this homily that Conway encounters really speaks to him. It's on the virtue of work. It says something to him about how he'd like to think of himself, how he'd like to value himself. And so we kind of, the same way we used this technique earlier to suggest people kind of getting into states or transitioning into states that are kind of spiritual, quasi-spiritual. Here we're kind of drawing on that shorthand for this sort of quasi-spiritual reverie. And just that fade to black of the environment has become our own, like, sort of part of our own aesthetic vocabulary, to be a shorthand for a hypnagogic state because of the way that we've used it earlier in the game. Although really, the main reason that we used this fade to black is so that we didn't have to animate Shannon opening up the storage unit in the back there. You can see she kind of walks to the back, and then it fades to black, and then fades back up, and she's standing in front of him. Character animations are like a really huge time sink for us, so any opportunity we can take to get past this. So yeah, this technique's really like a motif for us. It's something that shows up all over the place. And one last example that I want to look at is from the Hard Times Distillery in Act 3. So in this moment, Conway's being given a tour of this truck that if he accepts this job that he's being offered, this will be his truck to drive. And looking at the different parts of the truck are kind of triggering uncomfortable memories for him. So if you notice, the second dialogue option here is in italic, and it doesn't have a speaker assigned to it. That's a new kind of motif that we introduced here to kind of add a wrinkle to this idea of moving into these hypnagogic states. So this is like the sort of trigger, trigger smell or image or whatever. This is like the sort of entry point for Conway into this memory, and the rest of the memory happens in this italic treatment. We also see the environment fade to black again. And it happens a few times in a row. It happens 4 times in a row, looking at different parts of the truck. So you can see it kind of fading to black each time. But there's also a kind of like another fade underneath that whole sequence where the natural light in the environment is fading to black, almost like a kind of day to night transition that's happening at a much slower rate. Actually, what's happening in this case is each time we kind of fade to black, we turn down the global lights in the scene and turn up like some stuff like the headlights of the trucks and stuff like that to kind of move into this more nocturnal kind of view. So that's like a kind of subtle, more subtle sort of second layer in this case, and it kind of shows that Conway's sort of coming back a little bit less each time he goes into one of these uncomfortable memories. And that can either happen, that can happen a couple of ways in this distillery scenes, kind of. It can happen here by diving deep into these memories, or it can happen if you just drive around the environment a lot. The more you explore about the environment, the more he gets kind of pulled into this like night mode. So I'll turn it over to Tomas to, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, so here's a scene centered around the. Can everyone hear me? Okay, here's a scene centered around the another half asleep moment. This is where Conway is delivering a TV that Joseph gave him to deliver to this rural residence where Weaver lives. And this is actually the second scene that we worked on in the game, and also sort of pretty formative. It's a pretty formative scene for us defining a theatrical framework that we were developing. So. We were sort of deciding like which attributes of theater we felt we wanted to adapt into our game, especially with regards to like this slow or real-time pacing that we had started to explore. So in the way that we were like sort of thinking about real-time experience of like reading, we also were thinking about the real-time quality of theater performance. And so as we were moving away from like, as Jake sort of described, this text as like a repository of information, you know, how can we move away from treating an environment in the same way as like as a repository of information, or like an environment that you can systematically investigate at your own pace, like a dig site or something like that. So this is where we first started working with like a more constrained camera rig, which would sort of emphasize the flow or rhythm of like this dramatic space through pacing. And so here, going back a little bit, here we have a camera that only moves in one axis, and that's like sort of this Z space, right? And this sort of came out of this failed puzzle that we attempted in the Equus Oil's basement. It's like our first and last puzzle in this game. And it involved the shadow play that was in the basement, which was about moving you from one part of the basement to the next. So what happened, our solution was to like zoom in into this scene within a scene, which this shadow play sort of played out, and part of the way you progress through this shadow play is you turn a lantern on and off a few times until you realize you're somewhere else and it zooms back out, right? So that we wanted to sort of work more with this technique. So in this second scene, we sort of explored that a little more. So this camera rig is sort of indirectly driven by how a player progresses towards the endpoint of this scene, which is this barn, in one way or another, either through walking or through the dialogue. And this zoom is even sort of reminiscent of like this, of like hypnosis, right? Especially with the pacing, how it just really slowly zooms in. So actually, in a way, we're like shifting the control of pacing away from the player, and it sort of made us cognizant of like adapting this like real-time continuous property that's within theater performance and staging into our scenes. And then we found that these were also often properties that slow cinema filmmakers were investigating as well, where there's this emphasis of like expanding time instead of editing it down and truncating it. But also like often like in lockstep with this sort of framework, we had these practical limitations that influenced or shaped these specific moments, right? For example, here, like going into this project, neither of us were animators, like character animators. So as Jake said, it's like a huge labor for us to do this. So we had to make decisions about where we should sort of direct our labor and how we could best apply our skill sets. So here's one example of sort of something we had to deal with. So Conway has to set up this TV, he has to like plug this TV in, right? And we found that for us is like quite a labor to do this one-off animation, this like one-off gesture, right? And also it's sort of integrated with our more generalized player navigation system. So instead we just sort of fade the lights, right, as he's about to set it up. Sorry, I keep rewinding back to this section. Going a little bit too slow. So So what we do is we actually fade the lights, and then we set up the TV and change their blocking on the stage, so to speak. So like in this way, this sort of mundane act of plugging in a TV becomes like more operatic, right? It gives like more mystery to this TV, makes it feel sort of haunted. And just a little bit later, we like take advantage of this sort of framing again, where as you zoom into the barn and come back out, Weaver disappears and sort of suggesting that she might not be real or something like that. So these like dramatic flourishes end up really helping to build this mystery and get the player to tune in into this specific innermost scene with the barn right here. And also like another aspect of like character animation is because the process of reading is like so central to the experience of the game, is that we found that it's actually okay. It was actually okay to not really focus on gestures and just because like the player is sort of already attending the process of reading, that it would be sort of out of view. So while this wasn't really apparent to us while we were first working on it, the scene originally resolved itself as a sort of like asking the player to lose themselves in a reverie right here. And so the scene has this kind of symmetry where this camera rig is like zooming in scenes within a scene, right? And then so like traveling farther into this scene is like this hypnagogic experience, and then sort of returning back to the start plays out like this hypnopompic experience. And in the middle, there's this moment where the player needs to click to continue. And up until this point, everywhere in the game, we've been very explicit about player interaction. So there's always like a place you can click and like a feedback system to show that you can move there. And then modals sort of very clear and distinct on the screen that show you can interact with something. But here we're sort of breaking that, where we don't show any of that, and it's just an image, and then a little bit later, you see a mouse cursor pop up. So it's sort of a lot more subtle compared to the way that we treated this. And so, and then as this dialogue appears, we sort of frame this moment as Conway sort of snapping out of a daydream or reverie. So there's some other examples where how much time do we have? Is it still running?
Yes.
I don't know how to close the other video. What's going on? Oh, there it is.
Sorry.
It's full screen. Sorry, guys. So this sort of shares a similar symmetry like the farmhouse. So there's this kitchen that's actually mirrored between the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3. And again, like certain like practical limitations come into play, like the way that the staging is sort of set up as you enter this scene, right? Like Shannon and Ezra sort of come in walking, and then they leave the frame, and then they're sitting. So there's all these specific strategies that we use, these techniques to sort of avoid that, and they sort of reinforce this sort of theatrical element. So the challenge here was how to like make Conway's like the moment where he's like falling asleep and waking up really legible, right? And so we did this by projecting it onto the scenic design. So what's happening in the scene is that Conway is going to see a doctor to have his leg fixed or amputated, and he needs to basically go under an operating table, and it's sort of really indirectly represented here, but it's sort of projected in the scenic design here after through like typography, and then also sort of projected into the scene. You see sort of his inner state visible. So I just gotta go forward, and then here's the scene as he's waking up, So there's this emphasis about this slow sort of real-time pace, and everything, and it's sort of a continuous process. So you can see the kitchen mirrored, and then the kitchen table from the doctor's house. I'm just going to skip some other examples because we're running low on time. So as a side note, it's sort of interesting to us that in the VR world there's this emphasis on this word presence. Sort of like a evocative word choice. which is I was reading as like a shorthand for the word telepresence, which is defined as being somewhere other than your true location. But it's almost immediately disappointing because it's mostly this focus on these technical attributes of optical fidelity or something like frame rate or field of view. But we're sort of like interested in appropriating the word presence or something like it, at least, so not to talk about like a faithful sensory simulation, but instead talk more cohesively about this sort of abstracted real-time design, like the experience of reading or theatrical or dramatic flourishes or a transfixing pace or something like that, or other moments where that can act to either tune in or tune out a player's attention.
We have just one more example of this we wanted to show real quick. Let's see, it's gonna be, okay, so this is a moment in the middle, near the end, I guess, of Act 2. So we're at this museum, the Museum of Dwellings, and we meet up with Ezra, and then Julian, the bird, Ezra's brother, comes to pick everybody up, right? So he swoops down, picks everybody up. And there was this behavior that we discovered after releasing the game where, about like a significant percentage of the time, but like a small but significant percentage of the time, the game would just like completely crash right here, right? Right at the moment of impact. And the error messages were super cryptic, and we were never able to reproduce it. And we don't really have a lot of time to like fix bugs or anything like that. So our solution to this problem that we had trouble reproducing was we set a flag, like a game flag in our save game right here, and then we set another flag right here. And if the player had this flag set but not this flag, the next time they start up the game, they got this little scene where Shannon says, "Hey, Conway, I think you passed out." And so this again was like kind of using one of these half asleep states to sort of like mask other gaps in our capability, or just to kind of come up with interesting creative solutions to problems. Thanks.
Right, wiki wiki. After all these dreams, it was like, that was really cool. Okay, so our next speaker is Deidre Squinky Kiai, an MFA student at the Digital Arts and New Media at University of California, Santa Cruz. Also, long-time game designer, game developer. They've done a lot of different things. From music, I know that they have a love for music, and this is saxophone? No. Trombone? Tuba. You see? I know I had seen the trombone. Guitar as well. Amongst their achievements, we have they're going to present about Coffee and Misunderstanding, and also which was one of the finalists at Indicate. This past official selection at Indicate, this past edition. Also, Dominique Pamplemousse, which was a finalist at IGF in Narrative, Nuovo Award, Sound, and I'm missing one. Grand Prize. Oh, how could I miss that one? But also for those of us who are a bit more into the adventure game scene, they also made Chivalry's Not Dead and Life Flashes By, and lately Quink's Quest 7: The Death of Video Games, which should tell you something about what might happen next. Squink is going to tell us a bit about designing for awkwardness, so let's see it.
Hey. So thank you, Clara, for the intro, and thank you for getting my pronouns correct. So I go by they, them, their, theirs, themself. I don't know, so I just wanted to remind people of that. I've been hearing a lot of people refer to me as she, and that is incorrect. So thank you. So, I am best known at this point for Dominique Pamplemousse over here, which lost a lot of IGF awards to Papers, Please. Um, and it is also, like I said, about being about a protagonist who is genderqueer, as I am. I kind of came out with this game, so that was quite an experience. By the way, practice. If you want to attract a more inclusive group of people and speakers, one suggestion I have is gender-neutral bathrooms. They will go a long way. But sometimes people look at Dominique Pamplemousse and think that's the first game I ever made or whatever. It's like, oh, is that your first game? But in reality, yeah, like as Clara said, I do have a very, very extensive portfolio here. I am on about maybe year 12 of my 20-year project at this point. So I've been making, weird narrative things, graphical things, text-based things, you name it things. But yes, I'm going to talk about designing awkwardness now. Yay. So, we've all seen this graph before, probably. Particularly, Everybody talks about flow as this idea to aspire to in game design. And mostly we just like to pronounce Csikszentmihalyi, but but really, we come at game design with the idea that the experience should be smooth and fun for the player. That difficulty curves should ramp up gradually, and challenge and skill should be basically congruent to create an ideal game experience. Now, we've also probably seen this here, the hero's journey. This kind of linear progression. This is kind of like how stories go. The hero starts out with the call to adventure and goes through many obstacles along the way, but always but always perseveres and always comes out on top, and then defeats the final boss, and then comes back and is a hero. And so obviously as a queer post-colonial just marginalized person in many respects, I don't find those stories very interesting because they don't reflect my life at all. My life is as with many people, is a series of ups and downs and sideways and things not going how you expect, and life is just completely and utterly messy. So, if I want to represent a narrative in a game that feels true to me and have the gameplay reflect that, I want to use the entirety of this graph. Why don't I use the entirety of this graph over here and deliberately create for these sorts of situations through gameplay? So one thing I do, in particular, I work with a lot of choice-based narratives. I mean, they're sometimes dismissed for being oh, choose your own adventure, so simplistic, so boring. But really, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with just giving people a list of choices, a list of links to click on that or so. And one interesting thing I found is that the number of links, the number of possible inputs, can be kind of correlated to can be sort of correlated to this challenge versus skill graph in a way. So, for instance, like if you give somebody too many choices, there have been a lot of like studies done on this. It can get really overwhelming, and that's why like people sell like only a few brands of soft drink when you like go out to eat or whatever. There's a lot of like psychology about like there's this graph called the paradox of choice. You give people too few choices, and they get and they kind of get like annoyed, what, you're not giving me a choice. You give them a few more choices and they feel like they have more power, but then you give them too many choices and then it's all overwhelming again. So this is a screenshot from a Twine game I wrote called Imposter Syndrome. And it's about this woman who is speaking at a tech conference. I wrote it like in about mid-2013 when like I kind of started it after GDC 2013, and around that same time, there was an incident at another tech conference with Adria Richards, and so I was kind of inspired by that to write this game about like the experience of being a marginalized person talking in front of a group of mostly people more privileged than you. Sounds kind of familiar, yeah. So like when you start out the game, you kind of like hit this sense of like not quite full-on anxiety yet, but you do have like quite a few links to click on, and you're not quite sure yet where this story is going to go. So like, and then eventually you discover that the first 3 links kind of lead to flashbacks, and the last link is what gets you progressing forward in the game. And so the structure is very like linear in this way, until you get to a point where you actually get to make a choice. And at this point, players get all excited. Ooh, I can make a choice here. I kind of have some measure of control in this game now. Interesting. And so this thing happens like, do you dare look or do you just keep on going? So somebody alerts you that like, oh, you may want to look at the live feed because this talk is happening in the future where everything is augmented reality enabled, and you can see kind of a live feed of what's going on during your talk while you are giving it if you want to. So you are given this choice, do I look or do I not look? So if you say not to look, I decide to do something really, really mean, and and I do this. It's like, you look anyway. And how many times have we done this? We say we're not going to look at the comments, and then we do it anyway. Isn't that so annoying? So that like brings about a deliberate sense of like apathy, and it's like, oh God, like I have no control over my situation here. This is the worst. Well, guess what? This is what it feels like. So it's I think like it's definitely the kind of emotional the kind of emotion I wanted to instill at this specific part of the story. Now, so what happens after you look at this live feed is that you discover that Troll-chan has hacked the stream and for a split second, like, superimposed your face on a porn star's body, and then the mods reverted it, but it's too late. Everyone's seen it. So then you are given a chance in the game to say something. Do you say something? And if you pick the say something choice, you get this big field of links. So, anxiety, yay. And all of these, and clicking all of these words, except for 3 of them, except for better, power, and change. If you do click on any other word, you will be just like, you don't do anything, you just finish your talk and it ends just the way it ends. But if you click on one of the 3 words, then you actually do speak up. But then it's like also, not necessarily an ideal ending, because you get some repercussions from that too, which are pretty familiar to those of us who have been going through a bunch of online harassment crap in the last 3 months or so. Yeah. So, yeah, Imposter Syndrome was a pretty, grim story I wanted to depict, and which is kind of, departs from a lot of my usual, okay, fun, happy times kinds of things. And I really wanted to, underscore kind of the seriousness of the issue, so I definitely, tried to make the choice-based gameplay reflect that. Now, Queen's Quest, much more lighthearted, fun game. So this is a point in Queen's Quest where you get to do fun things like pick out your outfit. Yay! I've got a whole bunch of choices, and I can kind of cycle between them. And this scene is kind of the one that I got the most screenshots off of from Twitter. So that was fun. And there are also kind of more simple fun things you can do, you can take selfies. It doesn't really give you much in the way of choice, but it's also kind of relaxing because it's ooh, take a selfie. Oh, you get 123 favorites. Yay, how nice. Whee! So the game kind of progresses around on the more comfortable part of the scale, until you discover that the gamer police are after you. In which case, at one point, you actually get a giant field of links. Oh no! And then clicking on most of them just creates more text, and there's no paragraph separation, so it's kind of hard to read. So you just get this big wall of text that keeps on expanding as you click on links. And oh my god, they're here. What are we gonna do? Oh crap. And then, once you click on one particular link, this happens. You just start dancing. And then suddenly the game becomes a bit fun, because you get to make choices in time with the music. Yes, Richard, thank you for dancing. You are wonderful. Everyone else can feel free to get up and dance if they want to. I think this conference really needs a dance break. Yeah, you are all so awesome. You are the greatest. Can you feel the flow? Yeah. I told you I would queer this conference, so here we are. Here I am. This is not just a conference for white dudes. This is a conference for all of us. Awesome. Thank you so much. That was glorious. All right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Coffee Misunderstanding, which is a bit more involved than the choice-based narrative games that I have been showing you thus far. So for those of you who have not experienced or don't know about Coffee Misunderstanding, it is what I like to call a queer and socially awkward mobile device-assisted interactive play. I was asked for another thing to make a 10-word description, and that was my 10-word description. So basically what happens is all of the actors in this play are audience members. So I asked 2 people to come up and be the puppets. So they put on these wigs, as you see here, and then they're holding these mobile devices which tell them what lines they're going to read next. And and meanwhile, I get 2 more audience volunteers that play the drivers for these characters. So they kind of sit in the back and kind of like an avatar driving, a player driving an avatar. They, at certain points in the story, get to select dialogue options or suggestions for the puppets to act out. So, since this is kind of like a 2-person choice-based game in a way, like, in addition to all of the awkwardness of all these moving parts floating around, I have like tried to do some deliberately interesting things with the choices in the game as well, revealing different things about the different characters. So here in this instance, we have our 2 characters, Artemis, who is more of a curmudgeonly, like, introverted type, and Zeph, who is kind of like excited and a little bit fanboyish, and who follows Artemis on Twitter because Artemis writes a webcomic that Zeph is a huge fan of. So Zeph is just like really excited, bursting with questions. So when you kind of like get to one of the starting points of the game, so Zeph will have more dialogue options than Artemis has. Artemis will kind of like not really have that much to do because Artemis is in a bit of a like awkward situation. Oh my god, this person is talking to me. I don't know what to do. So yeah, as you can see, different points on the graphs. Later on, however, things like kind of even out a little bit more. Like Zeph can kind of draw Artemis out of their shell, and so more options become available. So now they are kind of like at about equal axes on the scale, which kind of like makes the gameplay slightly more symmetrical. But then there are other points, however, depending on how the discussion goes. So it can start to look like this. So this is what happens right after Zeph admits to having a huge crush on Artemis. Suddenly Zeph is speechless, and it's like, okay, so they go back to the apathy point, because it's like, I'm not entirely sure that apathy is necessarily the best word, but it's like kind of going back to a very neutral, very back to basics kind of state. It's like, okay, now I can't do anything right now. I just got to wait for the response. Meanwhile, Artemis is absolutely just like burning with like all sorts of thoughts going on in their head. And so that also like heightens a sense of anxiety. So there are a number of interactions that kind of like play out asymmetrically in these ways, and then kind of like just supported by everything else that's going on. All of the like just the whole fact that it's an interactive play, and with untrained actors performing it, just like heightens that sense of awkward. Yay. So yes, using the whole graph. I particularly want to talk about using the whole graph because, I did kind of experiment with making a game that only dealt with negative emotions for the most part, instilling that on the player. And that is very, very hard to get right, as I have discovered. the people who played Imposter Syndrome like really got it. It was familiar. It was kind of gut-wrenching, but it was not a pleasant experience to play. And a lot of people who I think could have benefited from that experience more, like due to lack of experience in that kind of situation. Like it was hard to convince people that my design choices were deliberate and not just bad game design. So with more of my work, I want to go with like just a much broader sense of emotion because like there should be pleasant emotions as well as unpleasant ones. I mean, like I don't like making should statements all that much, but what I am drawn to creating right now are works that encompass like all of human experience, all of life. I mean, like, from my limited vantage point, of course, I don't want to make any grand pronouncements. But life is just, like, if you're going to make a narrative game, I mean, like, making it about life as you experience it is the most honest way you can really go about doing it. And so I aim to represent as much of human experience as possible with that. Thank you.
We'll keep it short. We're going to have a Q&A before Eric steals all the microphones. But we'll keep it short, promise. It was very interesting how these talks actually overlap so much. Because initially it's like, it's just cool people I know that make cool games. And we had both references to theater and staging. But also I think that the running theme was how you were making games that are about experiences and how do we design an experience for the player, which is maybe something that that narrative games can do a bit better. But I'll steal the first question. Sorry, this is why I organized the panel. So I'm curious to hear a bit more about theater. I mean, you were mentioning theater. You mentioned theater too. What is it that you're fighting back in theater? Like when you bring in theatrical conventions, what is it that you're fighting against by making it into a game? Hard question. Sorry.
Is it okay? Oh, it is on. All right. Well, I am definitely fighting back against against kind of well, for one thing, I want it to be interactive. I want to empower blur the boundaries between like performer and audience. That's a big thing I want to do. I'm interested in like Augusto Boal's ideas of spect actors. So just bringing the audience in to the performance and creating kind of a mini sense of community is really interesting to me right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. That there's a lot of conflicts in theater within itself, that historical conflicts and tensions and stuff that we can kind of, I mean, some of I think some of the set design and stuff that we've looked at is like kind of pushing back against certain realism oriented ideas of what set design should be doing, and like Beowulf Borit is one set designer that we really admire, who a lot of his sets are about kind of making emotional spaces that are super metaphorical and super kind of emotionally driven instead of kind of rationally driven. And that's a sort of, so for us, I don't feel like we have a conflict in our practice with theater as it stands, or even with games as they stand. But yeah, certainly some of these historical conflicts are
a bit of pushback.
sparks.
I mean, it's like, yes.
Yeah.
So it's like actually the inspiration seems to be parts of theater that not traditional theater, not the fourth wall 19th century notions of theater for sure.
And also, like, I think there is a definite pushback against like nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia, and like traditionalism for the sake of traditionalism. Like, I feel that many of us like want to push boundaries. It's like we loved some things in our past, and it's like, now what? Okay, now what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we talk about what's going on now?
And we don't need super advanced technology for that. All right, questions. We have time for a couple of questions. All right. Do we have runners? No? No? Okay. Oh.
My question's for Squinky, which is, how do you test for these different emotions? Like, how do you test for them to see whether what you're doing in your game design is succeeding in generating these emotions in the player? Because I think with Flow, that's very easy. If the player is like engaged and wants to keep playing, you know your design choices have succeeded in that. But how do you know that particular design choice is actually generating anxiety? Or how do you know if it's generating boredom? Because like, if it's boring and then they quit, does that mean you've succeeded? Or so I'm just wondering, how do you confirm those choices have been correct?
Well, for me, like, mostly what I've gone on is more like, it's like just self-reporting. So people saying like, I felt like I had no power to make any choices in this game, and then being like, well, that was intentional actually. And then, but also like the problem of like, if they get bored, they might just quit. I mean, that's a fascinating thing for me. That's a fascinating problem I struggle with, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of like this general cultural sense of changing and expanding and broadening what kinds of experiences players should expect from games. So there's a lot of, so like, I obviously can't do anything about players getting bored and walking away, but shifting cultural expectations and trying to like encourage a sense of like, okay, well, some parts of this game will go slowly, and that's okay. Just kind of like take it in and enjoy it. I mean, like, I'm definitely not the only game designer recently who's been doing that. There have been kind of some other like games that are trying to promote like, it's like, all right, it doesn't have to be like all control all the time. There are times when you kind of have to just like relax and just or just like, if you're feeling bored, just accept that feeling.
All of y'all work in interesting mediums. So, for example, Squinky, you've made a game that effectively you play by using phones to control human beings. Cardboard Computer made
It's a mind control experiment funded partially by DARPA.
There we go. And then Cardboard Computer made a game that you play on a phone, like against phone trees. How are you choosing which media you want to make these explorations in?
Well, so for our part, the telephone that we did recently, the phone number that has a game behind it, there's a like kind of a weird romance to the telephone for me right now that I think has to do with it's kind of like where it is in time. And it showed up immediately after we released this game. People started posting just the phone number without context, and I saw a few people get replies to their posts on Facebook or whatever saying like, hey, I think you've been hacked. You shouldn't be, because like to post your phone number in public, I mean, it's a very real danger. It's a kind of secret value right now in 2014 to post your phone number in public. So for us, like working with these different media or these different like media channels or whatever, devices, these objects, it's about their kind of historical situation. I think that's,
yeah. So the reason I went with like mobile, like devices. Actually, they were iPod Touches. But the reason I kind of went for something that looked like a smartphone, I was originally like considering doing teleprompters for the puppets, and then like kind of after figuring out that the logistics would be kind of annoying, I thought about maybe trying to track down some Google Glass headsets and using that kind of like the augmented reality. But then like as I was thinking through it, I felt like, okay, if these characters wear Google Glass, it's going to tell a very, very different story, and these characters would not be the kinds of people who would have access to Google Glass. They don't come from as privileged backgrounds as Google employees. So I thought about like, it's like, why don't they just like stare at their phones? And so it's like, yeah, when you are on stage and you are like and you are performing a play, like you don't like read the whole time. That's just not really done very much. But I thought it was like a really interesting and compelling idea and commentary on modern technology. And the awkwardness theme again. It's very awkward, and it's very deliberately so.